"You don't belong here, and we both know it." Those words would cost flight attendant Bridget Miller everything she had worked for in her 12-year career, because she had just made the mistake of targeting 19-year-old Amara Cross, not knowing that the quiet girl in the oversized hoodie was about to make one phone call that would bring down an entire airline and change the aviation industry forever. The automatic sliding doors of JFK Terminal 4 parted with a mechanical whisper, letting in a gust of humid July air that carried the mingled scents of jet fuel, overpriced coffee, and the nervous energy of thousands of travelers rushing toward their destinations. But Amara Cross didn't feel the oppressive heat that made other passengers fan themselves with boarding passes and magazines, because her mind was already somewhere else entirely. Already mentally walking through the ancient stone corridors of Oxford University, where she would begin her sophomore year in just 3 days. At 19, Amara had learned the delicate art of selective invisibility, moving through spaces like JFK's gleaming terminals with the kind of practiced anonymity that comes from years of understanding exactly when to blend in and when to stand out. Today was definitely a blend-in day, which was why she had chosen her outfit with the same strategic precision that a general might choose battlefield positions. Her vintage gray hoodie was oversized enough to obscure her figure, worn and faded enough to suggest thrift store origins rather than the $600 limited edition streetwear piece it actually was. And the black leggings and scuffed Converse sneakers completed the carefully constructed image of just another tired college student traveling on a budget. The truth was considerably more complicated than her appearance suggested, because Amara Cross was the daughter of Victor Cross, the man whose company supplied aviation fuel to nearly every major airport on the East Coast, and whose wealth could have bought her first-class tickets on private jets to anywhere in the world. But Amara had learned early that flying under the radar often meant literally flying under assumptions, and she had grown tired of the particular kind of attention that came with looking like money in spaces where people made instant judgments about who belonged and who didn't. She approached the gate area with the boarding pass already pulled up on her phone screen, the green text clearly displaying Cross A. Seat 1A. First class along with the Atlantic Airways logo and Flight 882 to London Heathrow. The economy boarding line was already forming a serpentine queue that stretched back toward the duty-free shops where travelers grabbed last-minute bottles of perfume and overpriced chocolate. But the priority lane stood empty except for a pristine red velvet rope and a podium, where a gate agent sat reviewing passenger manifests with the focused intensity of someone who took their gatekeeping responsibilities very seriously. Patricia Williams had worked the priority lane at JFK for 8 years, and she prided herself on being able to spot the passengers who didn't belong in first class from 50 feet away, which was exactly the distance at which she began evaluating Amara as the young woman approached with her phone extended. Patricia's eyes moved in a practiced assessment pattern, starting with the hoodie that looked like it had been through too many washing cycles, continuing down to the sneakers that had clearly seen better days, and concluding with an internal judgment that was as swift as it was wrong. Miss Patricia said without looking up from her computer screen, her voice carrying the kind of bored authority that comes from processing thousands of passengers and developing strong opinions about who deserved premium treatment. Economy boarding is Zone 4, and we're not even close to starting general boarding yet, so you'll need to wait your turn with everyone else over there. She gestured with a manicured fingernail toward the growing line of economy passengers without bothering to make eye contact, as if the dismissal was so routine it required no actual visual confirmation. Amara had encountered this particular brand of assumption enough times that she had developed what she privately called the script, a series of responses that were polite enough to avoid confrontation, but firm enough to establish her legitimacy. "I'm actually in first class," she said softly, holding her phone closer to the scanner. The screen brightness turned up high enough that the seat assignment should have been clearly visible, even to someone who was actively trying not to look. Patricia finally glanced up, her eyes focusing not on the phone screen but on Amara's face, then immediately traveling back down to catalog the hoodie and sneakers once more, before settling into an expression that managed to combine skepticism with the kind of professional disdain that customer service workers sometimes develop as armor against dealing with people they assume are trying to take advantage of the system. "This is the priority lane," she said, speaking slowly and clearly, as if she were addressing someone who might have difficulty understanding basic airport procedures, and it's exclusively for first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members. So I'm going to need you to step aside so you don't block the actual customers. The words hung in the air between them like the acrid smell of jet exhaust that occasionally drifted through the terminal's ventilation system, and Amara felt that familiar tightening in her chest that came not from anger, but from the weary recognition that she was about to have the same conversation she had experienced in expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and exclusive shops where her appearance failed to match the expectations that came with the price tags she could easily afford. "I am a customer," Amara said, her voice firming up just enough to indicate that she was not going to be moved aside without proper consideration, and she stepped forward to place her phone directly over the scanner with the kind of deliberate precision that left no room for claims about unclear screens or technical difficulties. The scanner responded immediately with its cheerful double beep, the green light flashing as the screen displayed the information that Patricia had been so determined not to read: Cross A. Seat 1. A. First class. Paid full fare. The mechanical confirmation seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell between them, and Patricia's face underwent a color change that reminded Amara of the way clouds shifted from white to gray before a thunderstorm, flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and irritation that suggested she was more angry about being wrong than sorry about being presumptuous. Patricia's next moves were performed with the kind of aggressive efficiency that people sometimes employ when they realize they've made a mistake but aren't quite ready to admit it. Snatching Amara's passport when it was offered, flipping through its pages with unnecessary force as if she might discover some hidden evidence of fraud, and then practically shoving it back across the podium without the courtesy of eye contact. "Go ahead," she muttered through gritted teeth, the words carrying none of the warmth that usually accompanied successful check-ins, refusing to offer the smile or the "have a pleasant flight" that she would have given to a passenger whose appearance had met her expectations. Amara walked down the jet bridge with her phone tucked safely back into her hoodie pocket, shaking her head slightly at the predictability of the encounter, while mentally reciting the mantra that had gotten her through countless similar situations. Just get to the seat, put the headphones on, and sleep. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle these moments was to focus on her destination rather than the obstacles along the way. And right now, her destination was Seat 1A, where she could disappear behind a book or a movie until London appeared outside her window and she could step off the plane into a world where she was known for her mind, rather than prejudged by her appearance. The humid air of the jet bridge gave way to the artificially controlled atmosphere of the aircraft cabin, and as Amara stepped through the entrance, she was struck by the familiar sensory combination that always marked the transition into first class. The smell of leather conditioner mixed with the sharp chemical tang of sanitizing wipes, the soft hum of premium air filtration systems, and that particular kind of quiet that comes from spaces designed to insulate their occupants from the ordinary experiences of commercial travel. But underneath all of those carefully orchestrated elements of luxury, there was something else in the air. Something that made Amara's shoulders tense slightly as she moved down the wide aisle toward her seat, though she couldn't quite identify what it was that made the space feel less welcoming than it should have been. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 882 was arranged with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that was supposed to make passengers feel as though they had stepped into a private club rather than a commercial aircraft, with each seat upholstered in cream-colored leather that had been buffed to a soft gleam and positioned to provide maximum privacy and legroom for the 12 passengers who had paid premium prices for premium treatment. The lighting was set to a warm golden tone that was meant to be both flattering and relaxing, and the silence was the expensive kind that money could buy, broken only by the soft whisper of climate control systems and the occasional quiet conversation between passengers who spoke in the subdued tones that seemed to be required in spaces where a cup of coffee cost more than most people's hourly wages. Bridget Miller stood at the galley, organizing welcome drinks with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from 12 years of working first-class cabins. But anyone watching her carefully would have noticed that her movements had the slightly mechanical quality that suggested her mind was elsewhere, perhaps calculating tips or thinking about her weekend plans or running through the mental checklist that flight attendants use to prepare for takeoff. She was tall and blonde with the kind of ageless beauty that could have placed her anywhere between 35 and 45, and she wore her Atlantic Airways uniform like a costume that had been tailored specifically to project authority and competence in equal measure. At that moment, she was displaying the full warmth of her professional charm toward Mr. Henderson, a silver-haired businessman in seat 2A who was hanging up his expensive suit jacket with the careful movements of someone who understood the value of quality tailoring. "Let me take that for you, Mr. Henderson," Bridget said, her voice carrying the kind of honeyed sweetness that frequent first-class passengers had come to expect as part of their premium experience. "And can I start you with champagne before takeoff, or would you prefer something else to drink while we're preparing for departure?" Mr. Henderson chuckled in the pleased way that men of his age and economic status often did when they received the kind of attention they felt they deserved, settling into his leather seat with the satisfied air of someone who had made smart choices about how to spend his travel budget. "Champagne sounds perfect, Bridget," he replied, reading her name tag with the casual familiarity that suggested he was the type of passenger who made an effort to personalize his interactions with service staff, though not necessarily for reasons that had anything to do with genuine human connection. The transformation that occurred in Bridget's demeanor when she caught sight of Amara approaching down the aisle was so dramatic that it might have been visible from space, her carefully maintained smile vanishing as completely as if someone had flipped a switch, replaced by an expression that managed to combine confusion, disapproval, and territorial challenge into a single withering look. The warmth that had been flowing toward Mr. Henderson was suddenly redirected into something much colder, and she stepped directly into the aisle with the kind of deliberate movement that was clearly intended to create a physical barrier between Amara and the first-class seats. "Hold on," Bridget said, and her voice had undergone a transformation that was just as dramatic as her facial expression, the honey sweetness replaced by something that could have cut glass in its sharpness and hostility. "You're lost, sweetie, and I'm here to help you find where you're supposed to be, which is straight through that curtain toward the back of the plane, probably somewhere around row 30 or 35. Amara took what she hoped was an imperceptible deep breath, drawing on the reserves of patience that she had developed through years of encounters that followed this exact same script, and kept her voice level and polite as she replied, "I'm actually in seat 1. A while simultaneously trying to process the fact that a flight attendant was actively blocking her path to a seat that she had every legal right to occupy. Bridget's laugh was not the kind of sound that was meant to express amusement or joy, but rather the sort of noise that people make when they want to demonstrate that they find someone else's statement to be not just wrong, but absurdly, laughably incorrect. She turned slightly toward Mr. Henderson and the other passengers, who were beginning to pay attention to the developing situation, playing to her audience with the theatrical flair of someone who was accustomed to being the center of attention and enjoyed the power that came with having other people watch her exercise her authority. 1. Bridget repeated, her voice rising just enough to ensure that everyone in the first-class cabin could hear her clearly. "Honey, 1A is reserved for full-fare first-class passengers, the kind of seat that's usually occupied by CEOs or ambassadors or other people who can actually afford to pay for the kind of service we provide up here. So I think you might be confused about your seat assignment, or maybe you managed to scrape together enough frequent flyer miles for some kind of upgrade situation, but either way, I'm going to need to see your actual ticket before we can sort this out. The request itself might have been reasonable if it had been made in a different tone or with a different attitude, but the way Bridget snatched Amara's phone from her hand was such a clear violation of basic courtesy and professional protocol that several passengers visibly reacted, though none of them spoke up to point out that taking a passenger's personal property was completely inappropriate regardless of the circumstances. Bridget squinted at the screen, scrolling up and down with the desperate intensity of someone who was looking for any flaw or irregularity that might justify her suspicions, her eyes moving rapidly across the digital boarding pass as if she might discover hidden evidence of fraud or deception. Amara Cross. Bridget read aloud, her lip curling slightly as she pronounced the name with the kind of emphasis that was meant to suggest something distasteful. Well, computers glitch all the time, and there's absolutely no way you paid full price for this seat. So I think what probably happened here is that there was some kind of system error. Because look at you. She gestured vaguely at Amara's hoodie and sneakers with the kind of dismissive wave that was meant to encompass everything that was supposedly wrong with the young woman's appearance. We have a dress code in first class. Bridget continued warming to her theme as she noticed that her performance was drawing the attention of other passengers. Smart, casual is what we require. And you look like you're dressed for the gym or maybe for cleaning house, which is fine for economy class where people don't really care about maintaining standards. But up here, we try to preserve a certain level of sophistication for our premium passengers. Amara felt her patience beginning to fray around the edges like a rope that was being pulled too tight. But she kept her voice steady and factual as she replied, "There is no dress code for paying passengers. And I did pay for this seat, so I would appreciate it if you would give me my phone back so I can sit down and we can all get on with our day." Bridget held the phone just out of Amara's reach for a moment longer than was necessary, a small power play that was meant to demonstrate who was in control of the situation before practically dropping it into Amara's outstretched hand with the kind of careless disdain that might be shown toward something unpleasant that needed to be disposed of. "Fine," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You can sit down for now, but don't get too comfortable, because if the actual owner of that seat shows up and needs it for any reason, you're going to be moved back to economy class, probably somewhere around row 45 near the bathrooms where there's usually more availability." Amara brushed past the flight attendant and sank into the wide leather embrace of seat 1. Feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease slightly as she finally reached her destination, though she was acutely aware that Bridget's eyes were still fixed on her with the intensity of a security camera monitoring a potential shoplifter. She didn't ask for a welcome drink, didn't request a pillow or blanket, didn't engage in any of the small interactions that might have provided Bridget with additional opportunities for hostile commentary, choosing instead to focus on her phone screen and try to disappear into the illusion of invisibility that electronic devices sometimes provided. But the universe, it seemed, had different plans for Amara Cross, and those plans were about to walk through the aircraft door in the form of a woman who would turn an already uncomfortable situation into something much worse, setting in motion a series of events that would ultimately bring down not just individual careers, but an entire corporate structure that had been built on the assumption that some people's comfort was more important than other people's rights. 10 minutes into the boarding process, when the first-class cabin was beginning to fill with passengers who moved through the space with the practiced ease of people accustomed to premium treatment, a commotion arose at the aircraft entrance that immediately commanded the attention of everyone within hearing range. The sound that preceded the arrival of the next passenger was a voice raised in indignation, sharp and imperious, and carrying the kind of authority that came from years of getting exactly what she wanted through the simple expedient of making more noise than anyone else was willing to tolerate. Victoria Vance swept into the first-class cabin, like a force of nature draped in a faux fur coat that seemed wildly inappropriate for the July heat, but perfectly suited to her need to make an entrance that no one could ignore. She was dripping in gold jewelry that caught the cabin lights and threw tiny reflections across the cream-colored walls, and she carried a Louis Vuitton handbag that probably cost more than most people earned in several months, clutching it against her chest like a shield that announced her economic status to anyone who might have missed the other signals. Her face was flushed with the kind of righteous anger that came from encountering any form of inconvenience or delay, and she was moving with the agitated energy of someone whose carefully planned schedule had been disrupted by forces beyond her control, which was clearly a situation that Victoria Vance was not accustomed to accepting with grace or patience. "This is completely unacceptable," she announced to the cabin at large, her voice carrying the kind of projection that suggested she had either been trained in theater or had simply spent enough years commanding attention that volume control was no longer a consideration. She waved a platinum-colored credit card in Bridget's direction, like a flag of surrender that she expected would immediately resolve whatever problems had caused her distress. "I was specifically told that I would have the bulkhead seat when I made this reservation, and I made it very clear at that time that I absolutely require extra legroom because my sciatica has been acting up something terrible, and sitting in a cramped space for 6 hours is simply not an option for someone in my condition." Bridget's transformation back into professional service mode was as immediate as her earlier shift into hostility had been, her face rearranging itself into the expression of concerned sympathy that flight attendants reserved for passengers whose complaints came with the kind of frequent flyer status that could make or break their performance reviews. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice returning to the honey-sweetened tone that she had used with Mr. Henderson, "I am so terribly sorry about this mix-up, and I want you to know that we're going to do everything we possibly can to make this right for you. So please don't worry, because I'm confident we can find a solution that will meet your needs." Victoria's response was to point a ring-studded finger directly at seat 1B, the aisle seat next to Amara's window position, her gesture sharp and demanding as she declared, "I absolutely cannot tolerate aisle seats, because people are constantly bumping into you and the service card hits your elbow every time it goes by. And what I need is that window seat right there, because the window gives me something to lean against when I'm trying to sleep, and I always sleep better when I can control the shade." She swiveled her pointing finger 90 degrees to aim it directly at Amara, who was doing her best to focus on her phone screen and pretend that she couldn't feel the weight of hostile attention settling on her like a heavy blanket. "I want that seat," Victoria announced with the kind of imperial certainty that suggested she was accustomed to having her desires immediately transformed into reality through the simple act of expressing them clearly enough. Amara felt her stomach drop as she realized exactly where this conversation was headed, and she found herself looking out the window at the ground crew loading luggage into the cargo hold, focusing on their efficient movements and trying to send telepathic messages to the universe that this particular situation might somehow resolve itself without requiring her active participation in what was clearly going to be an uncomfortable confrontation. But Bridget was looking back and forth between Victoria and Amara with the calculating expression of someone who had just been presented with an unexpected opportunity to solve multiple problems with a single action. And the smile that spread across her face was the kind that suggested she was about to enjoy the next few minutes considerably more than anyone else in the immediate vicinity. The idea that was forming behind Bridget's eyes was as obvious as it was mean-spirited here, was a chance to satisfy a passenger whose displeasure could potentially cause problems for her career while simultaneously removing the young woman in the hoodie who had been bothering her from the moment she'd walked onto the aircraft. It was the kind of win-win situation that people like Bridget Miller lived for, and she approached it with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered that she could kill 2 birds with a single perfectly aimed stone. She walked over to seat 1A with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was about to handle business, and she tapped Amara hard on the shoulder with one manicured fingernail, the contact sharp enough to be genuinely uncomfortable and designed to ensure that there would be no possibility of ignoring her presence or pretending not to hear whatever demand was about to be made. "Excuse me," Bridget said. And even though her words were technically polite, her tone carried the kind of fake sweetness that was somehow more insulting than open hostility would have been. "We have a bit of a situation here that I'm going to need your help to resolve, because Mrs. Vance is a diamond-level, frequent flyer who happens to be a personal friend of our airline's CEO, and she has a documented medical condition that requires her to have access to a window seat for the duration of this flight." The cabin had grown so quiet that the only sounds were the whisper of the air conditioning system and the distant noise of ground equipment operating outside the aircraft, and Amara could feel every pair of eyes in the first-class section focused on her as she turned slowly to face Bridget, her mind racing through possible responses while her heart hammered against her ribs with the kind of frantic rhythm that came from recognizing that she was about to be placed in an impossible situation. "I'm sorry to hear about Mrs. Vance's medical condition," Amara said, her voice carefully controlled and polite despite the adrenaline that was flooding her system. "But I booked this specific seat 3 months ago, and I chose the window specifically because I prefer not to be disturbed during long flights." The temperature in this cabin seemed to drop several degrees as Bridget's fake smile hardened into something that looked like it had been carved from ice, and her voice carried the kind of sharp edge that suggested that polite requests were about to give way to something considerably more forceful and unpleasant for everyone involved. The silence that fell over the first-class cabin was so complete and oppressive that it seemed to have physical weight pressing down on everyone present, like the atmospheric pressure that precedes a violent thunderstorm. And in that silence, Bridget Miller's next words carried with the force of a declaration of war, rather than a simple request for passenger cooperation. "It absolutely does not matter when you think you booked this seat," Bridget said, her voice dropping the last pretense of professional courtesy and taking on the kind of sharp cutting edge that was designed to slice through any remaining illusions that this was going to be a polite negotiation between equals, because what matters right now is that I have a premium passenger with a legitimate medical need, and I need you to move immediately to accommodate her requirements. She gestured toward seat 4B, with the kind of dismissive wave that suggested the matter was already settled in her mind, and that any resistance would be viewed as unreasonable obstinacy rather than a legitimate defense of purchased rights. "Mrs. Vance's assigned seat will be perfectly comfortable for someone your age and physical condition, and frankly, it's probably more appropriate for your ticket class anyway." Amara felt something cold and sharp twist in her stomach as she realized that Bridget was essentially accusing her of not belonging in first class, without actually saying the words directly, using the kind of coded language that people employed when they wanted to express discriminatory attitudes without leaving themselves open to obvious accusations of bias. "Move where exactly?" Amara asked, her voice remaining level, despite the anger that was building behind her carefully maintained composure. To Mrs. Vance's original seat assignment, Bridget replied with the kind of forced patience that adults sometimes used when explaining simple concepts to children they considered slow to understand, or better yet, "I can probably find you a nice row to yourself back in economy class, where you might actually feel more comfortable with passengers who are more similar to your usual travel experience." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and unmistakably toxic, and Amara felt her hands clench involuntarily as she processed the barely concealed implication that she somehow didn't belong among the first-class passengers who were watching this confrontation unfold with the fascinated attention that people usually reserved for traffic accidents or natural disasters. "No," Amara said, and the single word seemed to echo through the cabin with surprising force, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade through silk, simple and clear and absolutely final in its implications. The cabin seemed to freeze completely at that moment, as if someone had pressed a pause button on the entire scene, and Mr. Henderson lowered his newspaper with the kind of surprised expression that suggested he had never witnessed a passenger directly refuse a flight attendant's instructions, while Victoria Vance gasped with the theatrical outrage of someone who had just witnessed an act of unprecedented insubordination. "Excuse me," Bridget said, and her voice had taken on a dangerous quality that suggested she was moving rapidly beyond annoyance and into the territory of genuine anger, the kind that made people do things they might later regret when they had time to think more clearly about consequences and professional repercussions. "I said no," Amara repeated, looking Bridget directly in the eye with the kind of steady gaze that she had learned from years of watching her father conduct business negotiations, where backing down was simply not an option. "I purchased this ticket. I am sitting in my assigned seat, and I am not moving because someone else wants something that belongs to me." Bridget straightened up to her full height, using her physical presence as a tool of intimidation in the way that people sometimes did when they realized that their authority was being challenged, and they needed to reassert their dominance through whatever means were available to them. She leaned down so that her face was only inches from Amara's, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly designed to make her uncomfortable and more likely to comply with demands rather than continue to resist. "Listen to me very carefully, you little brat," Bridget hissed, and her voice had lost all pretense of professional courtesy, revealing the raw hostility that had been lurking underneath her service industry facade from the moment Amara had walked onto the aircraft. "You are disrupting this flight and making our premium passengers uncomfortable, and if you do not immediately gather your belongings and move to an economy seat. Right now, I am going to have you physically removed from this aircraft by federal air marshals, and I can absolutely make sure that you end up with a criminal record that will follow you for the rest of your life." The threat landed in the cabin atmosphere like a bomb that had been dropped from a great height, and Amara felt her heart rate spike as she processed the realization that this situation had moved far beyond simple rudeness or even discrimination, and into the realm of active threats that could have real consequences for her future if Bridget was actually willing to follow through on her promise to involve law enforcement. The air in the first-class cabin felt thick and suffocating heavy with the weight of unspoken tensions, and the collective held breath of passengers who were watching this confrontation unfold, but seemed unwilling or unable to intervene, as if they were audience members at a theatrical performance rather than witnesses to an actual injustice that was occurring right in front of their eyes. "You're threatening me?" Amara asked, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silence, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was more incredulous than frightened by Bridget's escalation of the situation into outright intimidation tactics. "I am giving you a choice," Bridget replied, crossing her arms over her chest and glancing toward Victoria Vance as if seeking approval for her handling of the situation. "Mrs. Vance is a valued customer who deserves our best service, and you are a young, healthy girl who can sit anywhere on this aircraft. So moving to the back of the plane is really just a matter of showing proper respect for your elders and understanding your place in the hierarchy of air travel." "It's called theft," Amara corrected with the kind of calm precision that her father had taught her to use when dealing with people who were trying to take advantage of her through intimidation or manipulation. "I paid $5,000 for this seat, and taking it away from me to give it to someone else is stealing, regardless of whatever justification you want to use to make yourself feel better about it." Victoria Vance let out a high-pitched laugh that sounded like breaking glass, the kind of noise that people made when they encountered something so absurd that their normal responses were insufficient to express their disbelief. "You paid $5,000, she repeated, turning toward the other passengers as if seeking allies in her incredulity. Does anyone here actually believe that this child has $5,000 to spend on an airline seat? She looks like she probably sells bootleg DVDs in subway stations, or works at one of those places where they cash payday checks. A few passengers chuckled nervously, the kind of uncomfortable laughter that people sometimes produced when they witnessed something that made them uneasy but didn't know how to respond appropriately, while others looked away with the studied indifference that suggested they wanted to avoid getting involved in a situation that was clearly spiraling out of control. "I want to speak to the captain," Amara said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise and nervous laughter with the clarity of someone who had decided that this situation needed to be escalated to a higher authority before it got even more out of hand than it already had. "The captain is busy preparing for our departure and doesn't have time to deal with passenger disputes." Bridget shot back immediately as if she had been expecting this request and had already prepared her response. "I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft, which means I am the final authority on all matters related to passenger seating and cabin safety, and I have determined that you represent a security risk that needs to be addressed before we can proceed with our scheduled departure." A security risk. Amara's eyebrows shot up as she processed this latest escalation in Bridget's increasingly desperate attempts to justify her behavior through official-sounding language that might provide some kind of legal cover for what was obviously personal animosity disguised as professional decision-making. "Because you are being belligerent and refusing to follow crew instructions," Bridget replied, her voice rising in both volume and pitch as she realized that her authority was being questioned not just by Amara, but potentially by other passengers who were listening to this exchange and might be forming their own opinions about who was behaving reasonably and who was clearly out of line. "You are being aggressive and confrontational, and you are making Mrs. Vance feel unsafe in her own seat assignment." "I haven't stood up from this seat," Amara pointed out with the kind of logical precision that made Bridget's accusations sound even more ridiculous when stated plainly. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't made any threatening gestures or statements, and the only thing I've done is refuse to give up something that belongs to me." She paused to look around at the other passengers, "So I'm curious whether anyone here has actually felt threatened by my behavior in any way." The silence that followed her question was deafening, and it stretched on for several long seconds, during which it became increasingly obvious that none of the passengers were willing to support Bridget's characterization of Amara as a security threat, though it was equally clear that none of them were prepared to actively defend her either. "Mr." Henderson finally cleared his throat with the kind of uncomfortable sound that people made when they felt obligated to say something but weren't quite sure what would be appropriate under the circumstances. "Look, miss," he said to Amara, and his tone was not unkind but carried the patronizing quality that suggested he viewed this entire situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding that could be easily resolved if everyone would just be reasonable. "These ladies have jobs to do, and sometimes it's easier to just go along with what they're asking rather than make a big production out of something that's really not that important in the grand scheme of things." Amara felt a sharp sting of betrayal as she realized that even the passengers who seemed sympathetic were ultimately more interested in avoiding conflict than in supporting what was obviously the right thing to do, and that she was essentially on her own in this confrontation, despite being surrounded by people who could see exactly what was happening, but were choosing to remain neutral rather than risk getting involved. Bridget smirked with the satisfaction of someone who had just received exactly the kind of validation she had been hoping for, and she reached up to press the call button that would summon additional crew members to assist with what she was clearly planning to characterize as a passenger removal situation, rather than the discriminatory harassment that anyone with functioning eyes could see it actually was. "I'm calling for ground security," she announced with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggested she was enjoying this moment of perceived triumph, "and you're going to be escorted off this aircraft immediately, because I will not tolerate passengers who think they can disrupt our operations and threaten the safety and comfort of our legitimate customers." It was at that moment that Amara realized they were not going to stop, that this situation was going to continue escalating until she was physically removed from the aircraft, regardless of the fact that she had done absolutely nothing wrong, and she felt tears beginning to prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness or fear, but from the kind of pure, white-hot rage that came from watching injustice unfold in real time and knowing that the people with the power to stop it were choosing not to intervene. The call button's soft chime seemed to echo through the first-class cabin with the finality of a bell tolling the end of something precious, and Amara realized with crystal clarity that she had reached the point where polite resistance and logical arguments were no longer going to be sufficient to protect her rights or her dignity in this situation that had spiraled far beyond anything that reasonable people should have to endure during what was supposed to be routine commercial air travel. She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out her phone with movements that were deliberate and controlled, despite the adrenaline that was flooding her system, her thumb moving across the screen to find the contact that she had hoped she wouldn't need to use during this trip, because calling her father always meant admitting that the world had once again proven that her name and her appearance were not sufficient to guarantee that she would be treated with basic human respect. "Put that phone away immediately." Bridget barked with the kind of sharp authority that suggested she was beginning to panic as she realized that the situation might be moving beyond her control. "There's absolutely no recording allowed during crew operations, and if you're trying to make some kind of viral video out of this situation, I can have you arrested for that as well." "I'm not recording anything," Amara said coldly, her finger hovering over the contact labeled Dad. "Emergency," with the kind of hesitation that came from knowing that the next few minutes were going to change everything for everyone involved, though probably not in the way that Bridget Miller was expecting. "I'm calling my father." The phone rang exactly once before Victor Cross's deep, familiar voice filled her ear with the kind of warmth and concern that immediately made her feel less alone in the hostile environment that the first-class cabin had become. "Princess," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even through the electronic connection. "Everything okay? You should have been in the air 20 minutes ago." "Dad," Amara said, and despite all her efforts to maintain her composure, her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, because I'm sitting on the plane right now, and the flight attendant is trying to have me arrested and thrown off because another passenger wants my seat." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that Amara might have thought the call had been disconnected, except that she could hear the faint sound of her father's breathing, which had suddenly become deeper and more controlled in the way that she recognized as the precursor to the kind of focused anger that had made Victor Cross one of the most feared negotiators in the aviation industry. Meanwhile, Bridget was engaged in an increasingly animated conversation with Rick Santos, the burly gate agent who had just boarded the aircraft in response to her call for assistance, and her gestures were becoming more theatrical as she explained the situation in terms that bore little resemblance to what had actually transpired over the past several minutes. "She's been hostile and uncooperative from the moment she got on board," Bridget was saying, her voice loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear, as she pointed accusingly in Amara's direction. She refused multiple requests to move to her properly assigned seat. "She's been recording our crew operations without permission, and now she's making phone calls during safety preparations, which is a direct violation of federal aviation regulations." Rick nodded with the kind of professional seriousness that suggested he had dealt with similar situations many times before and had developed a standard protocol for removing disruptive passengers efficiently and with minimum fuss. "Ma'am," he said to Amara, his voice carrying the kind of weary authority that came from years of dealing with people who thought that buying an airline ticket gave them the right to argue with crew instructions. "I'm going to need you to end that phone call immediately and gather your belongings so we can resolve this situation as quickly as possible." "Who is that in the background?" Victor's voice cut through the ambient noise with the sharpness of a blade, and Amara could hear something in his tone that suggested he was already beginning to understand the scope of what was happening to his daughter. "The flight attendant is Bridget Miller," Amara said, speaking clearly enough for her father to hear every detail, "and she's telling the gate agent that I'm being aggressive and uncooperative because I won't give up my seat to Victoria Vance, who wants the window seat because she says she has sciatica." The sound that came through the phone was not quite a growl, but something much more dangerous, the kind of noise that Victor Cross made when he encountered people who had made the mistake of underestimating exactly who they were dealing with. And Amara could practically feel the temperature in the cabin drop several degrees, even though her father was miles away from the aircraft. "Put me on speaker, Jazz," Victor said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he was about to handle this situation in a way that would ensure it never happened again, because these people need to understand exactly what kind of mistake they're making. "They won't listen." "Dad," Amara replied, watching as Rick moved closer to her seat with the clear intention of physically removing her from the aircraft regardless of her protests or explanations. "They're convinced that I don't belong here, and they're not interested in hearing anything that contradicts their assumptions." "Ma'am, time's up," Rick interrupted with the kind of professional impatience that suggested he had already heard enough of this conversation to last him the rest of his career. "I need you to end that phone call right now and come with me, or this is going to become much more difficult for everyone involved. Don't touch her." Victor's voice roared from the phone with such volume and force that Rick actually took a step backward, his eyes widening as he realized that whoever was on the other end of that call was not going to be easily ignored or intimidated. "Who is that?" Rick asked, looking confused and slightly alarmed as he tried to process the fact that a simple passenger removal had suddenly become complicated by the involvement of someone who sounded like they had both the authority and the inclination to make his job much more difficult than it needed to be. "My attorney Amara," said smoothly, improvising with the kind of quick thinking that her father had taught her through years of watching him handle business negotiations where the stakes were high and the margin for error was essentially non-existent. "And if you put your hands on me without legal justification, you'll be committing assault and battery against a minor who has committed no crime and violated no regulations." Rick hesitated for a moment, his hand frozen halfway to Amara's arm as he processed the potential legal implications of what he was about to do, but Bridget Miller was having none of this delay in her plans to rid her cabin of the passenger who had been causing her problems from the moment she had first laid eyes on her. "Captain's orders," Rick said, though his voice lacked conviction as he spoke the words, and he reached out to clamp his hand around Amara's bicep with the kind of grip that was designed to be both controlling and painful, clearly intending to make it impossible for her to resist being removed from her seat. Amara cried out involuntarily as Rick's fingers dug into the muscle of her upper arm, the pain sharp enough to bring tears to her eyes, and her phone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers to clatter onto the cabin floor where it skittered under the seat in front of her. The connection to her father lost in an instant that left her feeling more alone and vulnerable than she had since this entire nightmare had begun. "That's right," Victoria Vance called out from her position in the aisle, clapping her hands together with the kind of enthusiastic approval that suggested she was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of watching a young black woman being forcibly removed from a seat that she had legitimately purchased. "Get that trash out of here so the rest of us can travel in peace." Rick hauled Amara to her feet with a roughness that was completely unnecessary and clearly designed to demonstrate his authority over the situation, and she stumbled slightly as she was pulled into the aisle, grabbing the armrest of her seat to steady herself while she tried to process the unreality of what was happening to her. "My phone," Amara said, looking back at the device that was now somewhere underneath seat 2A, but Bridget Miller was already moving to block her from retrieving it, a cruel smile playing around the corners of her mouth as she realized that she was about to deprive her victim of the one thing that might have provided protection or assistance. "We'll mail it to you," Bridget said with the kind of false sweetness that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility would have been, and she actually kicked the phone further under the seat with the toe of her regulation shoe. The gesture so petty and vindictive that several passengers visibly reacted with shock at the unnecessary cruelty of it. "Get her off this aircraft immediately." Bridget continued, turning to Rick with the kind of imperious gesture that suggested she was thoroughly satisfied with the way this situation had been resolved. We have a schedule to maintain, and we've already wasted far too much time dealing with passengers who don't understand how to behave appropriately in a premium cabin environment. Rick pushed Amara toward the aircraft door with the kind of casual force that suggested he viewed her as an object to be moved rather than a human being with rights that deserved consideration. And the passengers in business class and economy sections craned their necks to get a better look at the unruly passenger who was being ejected from the aircraft, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval, as they watched what they assumed was a well-deserved consequence for someone who had caused trouble for the hard-working crew. As Amara was pushed onto the jet bridge, the humid July air hit her face like a physical blow after the artificially controlled atmosphere of the aircraft cabin, and she could feel the metal grating beneath her feet vibrating with a frequency that had nothing to do with the aircraft's engines or the normal operations of the airport around them. Something that seemed to be coming from the ground itself, as if the very earth was responding to forces that were much larger and more powerful than anything that should have been affecting a simple commercial flight departure. Rick continued to grip her arm with unnecessary force, his fingers digging into the already tender spot where he had grabbed her initially, and Amara could feel bruises forming under his touch as he marched her away from the aircraft door with the kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested he had performed this exact routine many times before and no longer thought about the human cost of his actions. But as they moved down the jet bridge toward the terminal, something extraordinary was happening on the tarmac below them. Something that would have been visible to anyone who bothered to look out the windows of the aircraft or the terminal building. Though most people were too focused on their own travel plans to pay attention to the unusual activity that was beginning to unfold in the restricted areas where only authorized personnel were normally allowed to operate. A convoy of black SUVs was racing across the tarmac with the kind of speed and precision that suggested they were responding to an emergency situation of the highest priority, their blue lights flashing in patterns that identified them as vehicles with special clearance to operate in areas where normal traffic was strictly prohibited. And behind them, descending from the cloudy sky with a roar that could be heard even over the ambient noise of the busy airport, was a sleek black aircraft that was moving with the kind of aggressive purpose that suggested its pilot was operating under orders that superseded normal air traffic control procedures. The Gulfstream G650 that was approaching the tarmac carried distinctive golden lettering on its tail that spelled out a single letter C in a font that anyone familiar with the aviation industry would have recognized immediately because it belonged to Cross Industries, the company that supplied jet fuel to nearly every major airport on the East Coast and whose CEO had the kind of influence that could shut down entire flight operations with a single phone call. Rick had stopped pushing Amara forward and was now staring out the windows of the jet bridge with the kind of expression that people got when they witnessed something that didn't fit into their normal understanding of how the world was supposed to work. His grip on her arm loosening as his attention was diverted by the sight of the private jet that was now taxiing directly toward their position with the kind of reckless disregard for normal safety protocols that suggested whoever was controlling it had authorization that superseded the usual rules and regulations. "What the hell is that?" Rick muttered more to himself than to Amara as the Gulfstream came to a stop in a position that was clearly designed to block any movement by the commercial aircraft, positioning itself perpendicular to the nose of Flight 882, in a way that made it physically impossible for the larger plane to push back from the gate without risking a collision that would damage both aircraft and potentially injure everyone on board. Amara straightened her hoodie with as much dignity as she could muster under the circumstances, looking at Rick with the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing that the cavalry was about to arrive in force, and her voice carried a note of satisfaction that she made no attempt to hide as she replied, "I think that's my ride." Inside the cockpit of Flight 882, Captain David Rogers was experiencing what he would later describe as the most surreal moment of his 20-year career in commercial aviation, staring out the reinforced windshield at a scene that seemed to belong more to a political thriller than to the routine operations of a major airline. And his voice was strained with disbelief as he spoke into his headset microphone. "Tower, this is Atlantic Airways. Flight 882 he said, his professional composure beginning to crack under the pressure of trying to describe a situation that defied all of his previous experience and training. "We have what appears to be an unauthorized aircraft blocking our taxi route, and I'm going to need immediate assistance from ground security because this situation is completely outside normal operating procedures. Flight 882. Repeat your last transmission," came the confused response from the control tower where the air traffic controllers were looking at their radar screens and seeing what appeared to be a normal departure situation with no indication of the crisis that was developing on the ground level where their electronic eyes could not reach. "Tower, there is a private jet positioned directly in front of our aircraft." Rogers replied, his voice rising slightly as he tried to convey the urgency of a situation that was unlike anything in his training manual. "It appears to be a Gulfstream G650 with what looks like diplomatic markings, and it has positioned itself in a way that makes it impossible for us to move without risking a collision that could cause catastrophic damage to both aircraft." In the first-class cabin, the mood had shifted dramatically from the triumphant satisfaction that had followed Amara's removal to a growing sense of confusion and unease as passengers began to notice that something unusual was happening outside their windows, and Victoria Vance's complaints about the delay in their departure were becoming increasingly shrill as she realized that her victory over the young woman in the hoodie was not going to result in the immediate takeoff that she had been expecting. "Why aren't we moving?" Victoria demanded of Bridget, who was standing at the galley, trying to look as though she had everything under control, despite the fact that she could see the same inexplicable scene on the tarmac that was visible to everyone else with access to a window. "I have a very important connection to make in London, and every minute we sit here is making it more likely that I'm going to miss my next flight." Bridget moved to the cockpit door and knocked with the kind of sharp urgency that suggested she was beginning to understand that something was seriously wrong with their departure schedule. And when Captain Rogers opened the door, she could see immediately from his expression that whatever was happening outside was far beyond the scope of normal airline operations. Captain Bridget said, trying to maintain her professional demeanor despite the growing anxiety in her voice. "The passengers are getting restless about our departure delay, and I was hoping you could give me some information about when we might be able to get airborne so I can manage their expectations appropriately." Captain Rogers stepped aside so that Bridget could see out the cockpit window, and the expression on his face was the kind that people wore when they had just witnessed something that challenged their basic understanding of how the world was supposed to function. "Look for yourself, Bridget," he said quietly, "and then tell me how you think I should explain this to the passengers." Bridget looked out through the reinforced glass and felt her breath catch in her throat as she took in the scene that was unfolding on the tarmac below them, the black SUVs that had formed a protective perimeter around the jet bridge. The men in dark suits who were moving with military precision as they established what appeared to be a security zone around their aircraft, and most dramatically, the sleek private jet that was positioned like a roadblock directly in front of their nose gear. "Who are they?" Bridget whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the aircraft systems, and Captain Rogers could only shake his head in response because he had no more answers than she did about what was happening, or why their routine flight to London had suddenly become the center of what appeared to be some kind of high-level security operation. Down on the tarmac, the door of the Gulfstream was opening with the smooth precision of expensive engineering, and hydraulic stairs were unfolding to create a pathway between the private aircraft and the ground where Victor Cross was about to make an entrance that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their careers in the aviation industry. Captain David Rogers had flown through hurricanes over the Gulf of Mexico, navigated mechanical failures that had required emergency landings at airports that weren't equipped to handle his aircraft type, and once successfully landed a Boeing 777 with a completely disabled hydraulic system using only engine thrust to control his descent. But as he stood in the cockpit of Flight 882, watching the scene unfold on the tarmac below, he realized that all of his previous experience had not prepared him for the surreal reality of watching his commercial flight become the center of what appeared to be a diplomatic incident of international proportions. The radio communications from the tower were becoming increasingly frantic as air traffic controllers tried to understand how a private aircraft had managed to taxi directly into a restricted zone without proper clearance, and their attempts to reach the pilot of the Gulfstream were being met with radio silence that suggested whoever was in command of that aircraft was operating under authority that superseded normal aviation protocols. Flight 882. We show no filed flight plan for the aircraft currently blocking your taxi route, came the confused voice of the senior controller, and we need you to maintain your position while we attempt to establish contact with ground security to resolve this unauthorized incursion into your departure area. Tower understood, Rogers replied, though his voice carried the strain of someone who was trying to maintain professional composure while dealing with a situation that was completely outside his training and experience. But I need you to understand that we have 300 passengers on board this aircraft, and they're going to start asking questions that I don't have answers for if this situation continues much longer. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from confused annoyance to something approaching genuine alarm as passengers began to realize that whatever was happening outside their windows was far more serious than a simple departure delay, and the conversations that had been taking place in hushed, polite tones were giving way to increasingly urgent demands for information from the flight crew. Victoria Vance had abandoned any pretense of maintaining her composure and was now standing in the aisle making increasingly shrill demands for explanations, her voice carrying throughout the cabin as she declared that she had never experienced such unprofessional treatment from an airline crew, and that she was going to file complaints with every regulatory agency she could think of if they didn't immediately resolve whatever technical problem was preventing their departure. Bridget Miller was discovering that her authority as lead flight attendant meant very little when faced with a situation that was clearly beyond the scope of normal airline operations, and her attempts to reassure passengers with standard announcements about minor delays were becoming less convincing with each passing minute, as it became obvious that whatever was happening outside was anything but routine. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bridget said over the aircraft intercom system, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that she was trying unsuccessfully to hide. "We're experiencing a brief delay in our departure due to some ground traffic complications, and we appreciate your patience while the captain works with air traffic control to resolve this minor situation as quickly as possible." But the passengers could see the same view out their windows that Bridget had witnessed from the cockpit, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the convoy of black SUVs and the private jet that was blocking their path represented something far more significant than the minor situation that the flight crew was attempting to characterize it as. Mr. Henderson, who had initially seemed amused by the confrontation over Amara's seat, was now pressing his face against the window of seat 2A with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was beginning to understand that he might be witnessing something that would have serious consequences for everyone involved, and his earlier casual dismissal of the discrimination he had witnessed was being replaced by a growing sense of unease about what those consequences might be. The door of the Gulfstream G650 opened with the kind of smooth precision that only came from aircraft that were maintained regardless of expense, and the stairs that extended to the tarmac were not the standard airport equipment that most passengers were accustomed to, but rather integrated elements of the aircraft itself designed to allow its occupants to arrive and depart with the kind of dignity and privacy that ordinary commercial travelers could never expect to experience. The man who stepped out of the private jet moved with the kind of controlled purpose that immediately commanded attention from everyone who was positioned to observe his arrival, and even from a distance it was clear that this was someone who was accustomed to having his presence alter the dynamics of any situation he entered. Someone whose very appearance on the scene meant that whatever had been happening before was about to change in fundamental and irreversible ways. Victor Cross was tall enough to tower over most of the ground crew personnel who were watching his approach, and he wore a charcoal gray suit that had obviously been tailored specifically for his frame, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested money was never a consideration in his wardrobe decisions, but rather that every element of his appearance was calculated to project exactly the image he wanted to convey at any given moment. He wore dark aviator sunglasses despite the overcast sky, not because the light was particularly bright, but because they added an element of inscrutability to his expression that made it impossible for observers to read his emotional state or predict his next actions. And he walked across the tarmac with the measured pace of someone who knew that every eye in the vicinity was focused on him and wanted to ensure that his arrival had maximum impact on everyone who witnessed it. Rick Santos, the gate agent who had been so confident in his authority when he was physically removing Amara from the aircraft, was still gripping her arm, but with considerably less force than he had been using moments earlier, and his face had gone pale as he began to recognize the distinctive features of a man whose photograph appeared regularly in aviation industry publications, and whose name was spoken with respect and not a little fear in corporate boardrooms throughout the transportation sector. "Oh God," Rick whispered under his breath, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the jet bridge environment that's Victor Cross. The name meant nothing to Amara in terms of personal recognition, since she had never seen her father from this perspective, never watched him arrive at a crisis situation in full corporate battle mode, never witnessed the transformation that occurred when Victor Cross shifted from loving parent to the kind of business executive who could reshape entire industries through the application of focused pressure and unlimited resources. But Rick Santos knew exactly who Victor Cross was, because everyone who worked in aviation knew the name of the man who controlled the fuel supplies that kept their operations running, the CEO whose decisions about where to direct his company's resources could determine whether airlines prospered or struggled, whether airports remained profitable or found themselves struggling to maintain basic operations. That's your lawyer," Rick asked, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to process the implications of what he was seeing. Because if the young woman he had just manhandled was connected to Victor Cross in any way, then his actions over the past several minutes had just transformed from a routine passenger removal into something that could have career-ending consequences for everyone involved. "No," Amara replied quietly, rubbing the spot on her arm where his fingers had been digging into her muscle tissue, her voice carrying a note of calm satisfaction as she watched her father's approach. "That's my dad." At the bottom of the jet bridge stairs, a Port Authority police cruiser had arrived with its lights flashing, and two officers were stepping out with their hands positioned near their service weapons, clearly responding to reports of some kind of security incident that required immediate investigation, though it was obvious from their expressions that they had not been briefed on exactly what kind of situation they were walking into. "Nobody moves," shouted Officer Martinez, the senior of the two policemen, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with airport security situations where quick action was often the difference between maintaining order and allowing chaos to spiral out of control. "This is a restricted area, and you need to identify yourselves immediately." Victor Cross never broke stride, never acknowledged the police presence with anything more than a slight turn of his head, continuing his measured walk toward the jet bridge stairs as if the armed officers were simply part of the scenery, rather than legitimate authority figures who were attempting to control the situation, and his complete disregard for their commands was somehow more intimidating than any show of force would have been. Marcus Williams, Victor's head of security, and a man whose presence had been a constant feature of Amara's life since childhood, stepped smoothly between the police officers and his employer, with the kind of practiced movement that suggested this was not the first time he had needed to manage confrontations between his boss and local law enforcement agencies who didn't understand the scope of Victor Cross's influence or authority. Marcus reached into his jacket and produced a leather credential case that he held open for the officers to examine, and even from a distance, it was clear that whatever identification he was showing them was having an immediate and dramatic effect on their attitude toward the situation, causing both policemen to take a step back and lower their hands from their weapons in a way that suggested they had just realized they were dealing with something far beyond the scope of routine airport security. "Stand down, officers," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the tarmac, despite the ambient noise of aircraft engines and ground equipment. "This is a federal security operation involving a high-value protection scenario, and we have full authorization from the Department of Homeland Security to secure this immediate area for the duration of this incident." The police officers looked at each other with the kind of uncertain expression that suggested they were trying to decide whether to accept this explanation or to call for backup. But ultimately, the combination of Marcus's credentials and Victor Cross's obvious confidence in his authority to be where he was convinced them that this was a situation that was beyond their jurisdiction to control. Victor had reached the base of the jet bridge stairs and was beginning his ascent toward the aircraft entrance, the sound of his expensive leather shoes against the metal steps creating a rhythm that seemed to echo through the confined space, like the ticking of some enormous clock that was counting down to a moment of reckoning that everyone present understood was approaching, but that no one except Victor Cross was fully prepared to face. The ascent of Victor Cross up the metal stairs of the jet bridge created a sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire structure like the measured beat of a drum that was announcing the arrival of someone whose presence would fundamentally alter every relationship and power dynamic that had existed in this space just moments before. And with each step, the temperature in the confined area seemed to drop several degrees, as if the very air was responding to the approach of someone who carried authority like a physical force that preceded him wherever he went. Inside the aircraft, Bridget Miller was experiencing the kind of growing panic that came from the dawning realization that a situation she had believed was completely under her control was about to be revealed as something entirely different, and her attempts to maintain her composure were becoming increasingly difficult as she watched through the cockpit window and saw the convoy of black SUVs that had established a security perimeter around their aircraft, like some kind of military operation that was completely outside her experience or understanding. "Rick, what is happening out there?" she called toward the jet bridge entrance, her voice carrying a note of desperation that she was no longer able to hide. "I need you to get that girl off the jet bridge immediately and close the door so we can proceed with our departure, because I cannot explain to the passengers why we're sitting here indefinitely." But Rick Santos was no longer in a position to follow Bridget's instructions because he was standing frozen at the top of the jet bridge stairs, watching Victor Cross's approach with the kind of expression that people got when they realized they had just made a mistake that was going to have consequences far beyond anything they had imagined when they first committed to their course of action. The heavy door that separated the jet bridge from the aircraft cabin swung open with a force that suggested it was being opened by someone who was not particularly concerned about the normal courtesies that governed interactions between airline personnel and passengers, and Rick stumbled backward into the first-class cabin with the kind of unsteady movement that suggested his legs were no longer entirely reliable in their ability to support his weight. "Rick, what are you doing?" Bridget hissed as she saw her supposed ally retreating into the cabin. Rather than maintaining control of the situation, as she had expected, "I told you to remove that passenger from the jet bridge and secure the entrance so we can get this aircraft moving toward our scheduled departure time." Rick couldn't speak coherently enough to explain what was happening, and instead, he simply pointed toward the open door with a trembling finger, his face having taken on a grayish pallor that suggested he was in some form of shock. And when Bridget followed his gesture, she saw Amara Cross stepping back into the aircraft cabin with the kind of quiet dignity that suggested she had never doubted that this moment would eventually arrive. Amara's hoodie was slightly torn at the shoulder where Rick had grabbed her, and there was a red mark on her upper arm that would probably develop into a bruise within the next few hours. But she walked into the first-class cabin and stood there in silence with the kind of composed bearing that made it clear she was no longer the vulnerable teenager who had been manhandled out of her seat just minutes before, but rather someone who knew that reinforcements were about to arrive that would fundamentally change the balance of power in this situation. Behind Amara, a shadow fell across the entrance to the aircraft as Victor Cross stepped through the doorway that separated the jet bridge from the passenger cabin, and the space that had seemed spacious and comfortable just moments before suddenly felt confined and inadequate to contain the presence of someone who commanded attention through sheer force of personality and the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of wielding power in situations where the stakes were measured in billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. Victor removed his sunglasses with a deliberate motion that revealed eyes that burned with the kind of cold intelligence that made it clear he had already assessed every person and every relationship in the cabin and had formulated a plan for dealing with the situation that would ensure justice was served and that similar incidents would never happen again. At least not without consequences that would serve as a deterrent to anyone else who might be tempted to abuse their authority in similar ways. He was tall enough that he seemed to loom over everyone else in the cabin, but his presence was commanding not because of his physical size, but rather because of the aura of controlled power that surrounded him like an invisible field that made it clear to everyone present that they were now in the presence of someone who could alter their lives with a single decision. Someone whose displeasure would have consequences that extended far beyond this aircraft and this particular incident. The silence in the cabin was so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance pressing down on the passengers and crew members who found themselves suddenly unable to speak or move as they tried to process the reality that their routine flight had been transformed into something that resembled a courtroom where judgment was about to be rendered by someone whose authority was absolute and whose decisions would be final. Victor walked past Rick as if the gate agent were invisible, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had a specific destination in mind and would not be deterred by anything or anyone who might attempt to interfere with his progress. And he positioned himself next to his daughter with the protective instinct of a parent whose child had been threatened and who was prepared to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that those responsible for the threat faced appropriate consequences. He placed a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder, the gesture careful and tender, in a way that contrasted sharply with the controlled fury that was evident in every other aspect of his demeanor, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough that only she could hear him clearly, though the concern and love in his tone carried throughout the cabin, like an echo that made it clear to everyone present that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple business dispute. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" he asked softly, his eyes scanning her face and taking note of the tear in her hoodie and the red mark on her arm that provided physical evidence of the mistreatment she had endured. And when she nodded slightly and whispered that her arm hurt and that they had taken her phone, something shifted in his expression that made the temperature in the cabin seem to drop another 10 degrees. Victor's jaw tightened with the kind of controlled tension that suggested he was expending considerable effort to maintain his composure in the face of evidence that his daughter had been physically assaulted by airline personnel, and when he raised his head to look at Bridget Miller, who was trembling near the galley while clutching a serving tray against her chest like a shield. His voice carried the kind of quiet menace that was far more frightening than any amount of shouting would have been. "My daughter tells me," Victor said, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the first-class cabin and beyond into the business-class section where passengers were straining to hear what was happening in the premium cabin, "that you attempted to steal her seat, that you called her aggressive when she refused to surrender property that belonged to her, that you made threats about having her arrested, and that your associate here physically assaulted her and stole her personal property." Bridget swallowed hard, trying to summon some vestige of the authority that had served her so well when she was dealing with passengers who had no recourse against her arbitrary decisions. But she was discovering that her uniform and her title meant nothing when confronted by someone who operated in spheres where her kind of petty power was not just irrelevant, but actively dangerous to wield inappropriately. "Sir, you are not authorized to be on this aircraft," she managed to say, her voice trembling as she tried to invoke the safety regulations that were supposed to protect airline personnel from interference by unauthorized individuals. This is a violation of federal aviation security protocols, and I need to ask you to leave immediately before I'm forced to call for additional security assistance." Or what Victor interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous quiet that suggested he was genuinely curious about what she thought her options might be in this situation. "You'll call the police. They're outside, and they work for agencies that depend on federal contracts that my company helps to fund. You'll call airport security. I had dinner with the director of airport operations last night, and we discussed ways that my company could expand its support for infrastructure improvements." He took a step closer to Bridget, not in a threatening way, but with the kind of measured movement that made it clear he was completely comfortable with confrontation and had no intention of being intimidated by threats from someone who had just demonstrated that she was willing to abuse her authority against vulnerable passengers. "My name is Victor Cross," he said, his voice carrying easily throughout the cabin and ensuring that every passenger and crew member would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. "I am the chairman and CEO of Cross Industries, and right now I am the only reason this aircraft is still connected to a fuel supply, instead of being stranded at the gate while your company's board of directors tries to figure out how to apologize for the fact that their employees just committed assault against my daughter." The name Victor Cross rippled through the first-class cabin like a shockwave, and Mr. Henderson, who had earlier dismissed Amara's concerns with patronizing advice about going along to get along, went pale as he recognized the name of one of the most powerful figures in the aviation industry. A man whose decisions about fuel contracts could determine whether airlines prospered or found themselves struggling to maintain basic operations. Cross Industries controlled fuel supplies for most of the major airports on the East Coast, and Victor Cross's influence extended far beyond simple business relationships into the realm of regulatory policy and government contracts that could affect everything from airport security to federal aviation regulations, which meant that his displeasure could have consequences that reached every level of the aviation industry, from ground crew workers to airline executives to federal regulators. Victoria Vance, however, was not as well informed about the business aspects of commercial aviation, and she responded to Victor's introduction with the kind of entitled indignation that came from years of believing that her wealth and social connections made her immune to consequences for her behavior regardless of how inappropriate or harmful that behavior might be to other people. "I don't care who you think you are," Victoria declared from seat 1. Standing up and fluffing her faux fur coat with the kind of theatrical gesture that was designed to demonstrate that she was not impressed by names or titles or any other form of authority that might challenge her own sense of importance. "This seat was given to me by the flight attendant because I am a Diamond Medallion member with this airline, and I have medical needs that require accommodation while your daughter was dressed inappropriately and clearly didn't belong in first class to begin with." Victor turned his head slowly to look at Victoria with the kind of measured attention that a predator might give to prey that had just made the mistake of drawing attention to itself, and his voice, when he responded, carried the kind of icy precision that made it clear he was no longer merely displeased, but had moved into the realm of active hostility toward everyone who had participated in the mistreatment of his child. "A Diamond Medallion member," Victor repeated, his voice carrying a note of contempt that made the title sound absurd when spoken aloud. "You believe that a plastic loyalty card gives you the right to steal from other passengers? My daughter is a sophomore at Oxford University. She maintains a perfect academic record while volunteering at legal aid clinics, and she paid full fare for that seat to ensure her safety and comfort during international travel." He paused for a moment to let this information sink in before continuing. "You, on the other hand, appear to be someone who believes that making noise and demanding special treatment will somehow transform theft into legitimate accommodation, which suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how contracts and property rights actually function in civilized society." "How dare you speak to me that way?" Victoria gasped, her face flushing with the kind of outrage that came from encountering someone who was completely immune to her usual tactics of intimidation and social pressure. "Bridget, you need to do something about these people immediately. because I will not tolerate being insulted by someone who doesn't understand proper respect for paying customers. But Bridget Miller was discovering that her position as lead flight attendant provided no protection against someone like Victor Cross, and her attempts to reassert her authority were beginning to sound increasingly desperate as she realized that every word she spoke was only making her situation worse, rather than better. "Mr. Cross," she said, her voice shaking with the effort of trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure. "I understand that you're upset about what you perceive as unfair treatment of your daughter, but airline safety regulations require that crew members have the final authority over seating arrangements, and your daughter was being uncooperative when she refused to follow my direct instructions regarding passenger accommodation." An illegal order, Victor corrected with the kind of precision that suggested he was very familiar with the relevant regulations and legal precedents. You cannot remove a passenger from a seat they have legitimately purchased in order to accommodate another passenger's preferences, which violates both federal aviation regulations and your own airline's contract of carriage. And I know this because my legal team helped write the liability clauses in those contracts when your airline was restructured 3 years ago. Bridget's face flushed red as she realized that her justifications were not only failing to convince Victor Cross, but were actually providing him with additional evidence that could be used against her in whatever consequences were about to follow from this incident. And her next attempt to defend her actions carried the desperate tone of someone who was grasping at increasingly weak straws. She had an attitude, Bridget said, her voice rising slightly as she tried to find some angle that might justify her behavior. She looked at me with defiance and disrespect, and she was using her phone to record our crew operations, which is against federal security regulations and could have compromised the safety of this aircraft. She was calling her father. Victor said, his voice dropping to the kind of dangerous quiet that suggested he was reaching the limits of his patience with explanations that bore no resemblance to reality, because she was frightened by the fact that an adult woman was bullying a teenager for no reason other than her own prejudices and power fantasies. He turned to look at Rick Santos, who had been trying to make himself invisible near the aircraft entrance, but was now finding himself the focus of attention from someone whose displeasure could have consequences that extended far beyond his job at the airport. And Victor's next words carried the weight of a final judgment that would determine the gate agent's future in the aviation industry. "And you," Victor said, his voice cutting through Rick's attempts to fade into the background. "You put your hands on my daughter, you bruised her arm, and you participated in stealing her personal property, all at the direction of someone who had no legal authority to order such actions." The arrival of Arnold Black, Atlantic Airways' station manager at JFK, was announced by the sound of running footsteps echoing through the jet bridge and the kind of panicked shouting that suggested someone was dealing with a crisis that threatened to overwhelm their ability to manage the situation effectively. Arnold burst through the aircraft entrance looking disheveled and out of breath, his tie askew and his usually immaculate appearance showing clear signs of the stress that came from receiving urgent calls from corporate headquarters about incidents involving passengers whose names appeared on lists of people who should never be inconvenienced under any circumstances. "Mr. Cross," Arnold gasped, bending over slightly to catch his breath while trying to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. "I received an emergency call from our corporate offices, and I came as quickly as possible to personally ensure that any misunderstandings are resolved to your complete satisfaction." Victor looked at the station manager with the kind of expression that suggested he was evaluating whether Arnold was part of the problem or might potentially become part of the solution, and his response carried the weight of someone who had already made decisions about consequences and was now simply determining how those consequences would be implemented. "This is not a misunderstanding. Arnold," Victor said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that made it clear he was not interested in explanations that attempted to minimize what had occurred. "This is a crime. Your employees profiled my daughter based on her appearance, attempted to steal her paid seat to accommodate another passenger's preferences, physically assaulted her when she refused to surrender her property, and then stole her personal belongings while removing her from the aircraft. Arnold's face went through a series of color changes as he processed the implications of what Victor was describing, because he understood that incidents involving discrimination and physical assault could result in federal investigations, regulatory sanctions, and civil liability that could cost the airline millions of dollars in damages and potentially threaten its operating certificates. "We will immediately launch a comprehensive internal investigation," Arnold promised, his voice carrying the kind of desperate sincerity that came from recognizing that his own career was probably hanging in the balance. "And I can assure you that anyone found to have violated our policies or federal regulations will face appropriate disciplinary action up to and including termination." "Not sufficient," Victor replied with the kind of finality that suggested this was not a negotiation, but rather a statement of terms that would be accepted or would result in consequences that Arnold was not prepared to face. "I want the police to take statements from my daughter right now, and I want assault charges filed against Ms. Miller for battery and against that woman in seat 1A for harassment and theft of services." He paused to look directly at Arnold with the kind of intense focus that made it clear the next few minutes would determine whether the situation could be resolved through cooperation or would escalate to levels that could threaten the entire airline's operations. "If those two individuals are not in handcuffs and being removed from this aircraft within the next 10 minutes, Victor continued, "Cross Industries will be suspending all fuel supply contracts with Atlantic Airways at every airport where we operate, which will effectively ground your entire fleet until you can make alternative arrangements that will cost approximately 10 times what you currently pay for our services." Arnold Black looked at the police officers who had accompanied him onto the aircraft, then back at Victor Cross, then toward the passengers who were watching this confrontation unfold, with the fascinated attention of people who understood they were witnessing something that would probably become legendary in aviation industry circles. And his next words carried the grim resignation of someone who understood that he had no choice but to comply with demands that would destroy careers but might save his airline. "Officers," Arnold said, his voice heavy with the knowledge that he was about to end the careers of employees who had probably thought they were simply doing their jobs according to the unwritten rules that governed customer service in premium cabins. "I need you to place Ms. Miller under arrest for assault, and I need you to take Mrs. Vance into custody for theft of services and harassment." The transformation that occurred in the first-class cabin at that moment was unlike anything that most commercial aviation passengers had ever witnessed, as the normal power relationships that governed interactions between crew members and travelers were completely reversed, and the people who had been wielding authority just minutes before found themselves facing the reality that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their ability to control or mitigate. Officer Martinez stepped forward with his handcuffs ready, his expression carrying the professional seriousness of someone who had dealt with enough airport security situations to understand that this was not a routine passenger disturbance, but rather a criminal matter that would require proper documentation and formal charges. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice carrying the kind of official authority that brooked no argument or delay, "you need to turn around and place your hands behind your back because you're under arrest for assault and battery, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Bridget's response was a shriek of disbelief that echoed throughout the cabin and probably carried into the business class section, where passengers were straining to hear what was happening in the drama that was unfolding just beyond their view. "You cannot arrest me. I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. I was following proper procedures for dealing with an unruly passenger." "Turn around, ma'am," Officer Martinez repeated, his voice allowing no room for argument as he prepared to use whatever force might be necessary to complete the arrest. "Resistance will only result in additional charges being filed against you." The clicking sound of the handcuffs closing around Bridget's wrists seemed to echo through the cabin with a finality that marked the end of her career in aviation and the beginning of consequences that would follow her for years to come. And her progression from confident authority figure to arrested criminal occurred so quickly that several passengers actually gasped audibly at the dramatic reversal of fortune they were witnessing. Meanwhile, Victoria Vance was discovering that her wealth and social connections provided no protection against law enforcement officers who were operating under direct orders from airline management and were dealing with criminal charges that had been formally requested by someone with the power to destroy the airline if his demands were not met promptly and completely. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back," Officer Rodriguez said to Victoria, who was still sitting in the stolen seat 1A and clutching her expensive handbag as if it might somehow provide protection against the consequences of her actions. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Victoria declared, her voice rising to the kind of shrill pitch that suggested she was beginning to understand that her usual tactics were not going to be effective in this situation. "I am a valued customer of this airline, and I will not be treated like a common criminal for requesting appropriate accommodation for my medical needs. You're being arrested for theft of services and harassment," Officer Rodriguez explained with the kind of patient professionalism that suggested he had dealt with entitled passengers before and understood that they often required additional explanation before they accepted the reality of their situation. "And if you don't cooperate voluntarily, we'll be adding resisting arrest to the list of charges." The perp walk that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the first-class cabin of a commercial aircraft, as both Bridget Miller and Victoria Vance were escorted down the aisle past passengers who were recording the entire scene, with their phones creating documentation that would ensure this incident became part of aviation industry folklore and would serve as a permanent reminder of what could happen when customer service crossed the line into criminal behavior. Mr. Henderson, who had earlier advised Amara to simply comply with Bridget's illegal demands rather than cause trouble, was now holding his phone up to record the arrests with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he understood he was witnessing something historically significant, and his earlier complicity in the discrimination had been replaced by a desire to document the consequences that followed when authority was abused against vulnerable passengers. As the arrested women were led off the aircraft and down the jet bridge toward the police cars that were waiting on the tarmac below, Victor Cross turned to his daughter with the kind of gentle concern that marked the transition from protective father executing justice to loving parent, ensuring that his child was safe and comfortable. "Are you ready to get out of here, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth and affection that had been carefully controlled during his confrontation with the airline personnel, but was now free to express the love and concern that had motivated his dramatic intervention. Amara nodded, looking around the first-class cabin that had been the site of so much conflict and humiliation just minutes before, but was now simply an expensive room filled with expensive seats, occupied by people who would probably never forget what they had witnessed and would certainly never again assume that their money or status made them immune to consequences when they participated in or enabled discrimination. "Let's go home," she said quietly, taking her father's offered arm and walking with him toward the aircraft entrance where the Gulfstream was waiting to take them to London in the kind of luxury and dignity that should have been available to all passengers, but was unfortunately still reserved for those with the power to demand justice when they were denied basic human respect. Behind them, the first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 882 sat empty, except for the abandoned seats and the memories of a confrontation that would ultimately lead to policy changes, corporate restructuring, and a fundamental shift in how aviation companies trained their employees to treat passengers who didn't fit their preconceptions about who belonged in premium cabins. 3 hours after the arrest of Bridget Miller and Victoria Vance, the holding cells at the JFK Port Authority Police Precinct had become the setting for a series of conversations that would determine how much additional misery these two women would experience as consequences for their actions during what was already being referred to throughout the aviation industry as the Cross Industries incident. The cells themselves were designed to be as uncomfortable as possible, while still meeting basic legal requirements for prisoner accommodation, with cinder block walls painted in institutional gray metal benches that were cold to the touch even in summer weather, and fluorescent lighting that flickered occasionally and cast harsh shadows that made everyone look pale and sickly, regardless of their actual physical condition. Bridget sat on the metal bench with her hands still cuffed in front of her, shivering slightly despite the summer heat that made the rest of the airport uncomfortable. Because the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in with the weight of an avalanche that was burying everything she had thought she knew about her life and career under layers of consequences that she had never imagined when she first decided to target a young black woman for removal from first class. She had worked for Atlantic Airways for 12 years, climbing from entry-level positions to her current status as senior flight attendant through what she had believed was dedication and professionalism. But she was now discovering that those 12 years of service meant nothing when weighed against a single incident that had revealed the discriminatory attitudes that had probably been influencing her decisions throughout her entire career. Her pension, her seniority, her professional reputation, and her future employment prospects in the aviation industry had all been destroyed in the span of less than an hour, and she was beginning to understand that the consequences of this incident would follow her for the rest of her life in ways that extended far beyond whatever criminal penalties she might face. In the adjacent cell, Victoria Vance was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, her expensive clothing now wrinkled and disheveled from the arrest process, and her voice had become hoarse from the constant stream of threats and demands she had been directing toward any police officer who came within hearing range. "I want my phone call right now," she was shouting at the reinforced glass that separated her from the booking area. "My husband is Richard Vance of Vance Construction, and when he finds out how I've been treated here, there are going to be lawsuits that will cost this department more money than you people make in a decade." But Victoria's demands were falling on deaf ears because the police officers who were processing her arrest had already received calls from their supervisors explaining that this case involved individuals whose actions had been recorded on multiple phones and uploaded to social media platforms where they were being viewed by millions of people who were expressing their outrage at what they perceived as clear examples of racial discrimination and abuse of authority. The door to the interrogation area opened to admit a man in an expensive navy blue suit who carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he was accustomed to walking into situations where other people's futures were being decided and taking control of outcomes through the application of superior knowledge and unlimited resources. Harrison Thorne was Victor Cross's personal attorney, though that description barely captured the scope of his influence and capabilities, because he was known throughout legal circles as someone who could dismantle opposing cases with surgical precision, while simultaneously constructing ironclad legal strategies that could withstand challenges from entire teams of corporate lawyers working around the clock to find weaknesses. "Mrs. Miller," Harrison said as he entered the interrogation room where Bridget was sitting, setting his leather briefcase on the metal table with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he was about to present information that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her situation. "My name is Harrison Thorne, and I represent Victor Cross and his daughter Amara in all matters related to today's incident." Bridget looked up with the kind of desperate hope that people displayed when they thought they might be about to receive help from an unexpected source because she had been sitting in the cold cell for hours without any contact from Atlantic Airways management or union representatives, and she was beginning to understand that she might be facing this crisis completely alone. "Are you here to help me?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of plaintive quality that suggested she was willing to accept assistance from anyone who might be able to improve her situation, regardless of their connection to the people who were pressing charges against her. Harrison's laugh was not cruel, but it was completely devoid of warmth or sympathy, the sound that a professional makes when encountering someone who has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their relationship. "I'm here to ensure that you understand the scope of the legal consequences you're facing," he replied, opening his briefcase and removing a tablet that he positioned so that Bridget could see the screen, and to offer you an opportunity to minimize the damage to your future by cooperating with my client's requirements. The tablet displayed a video that Bridget recognized immediately as the recording that Mr. Henderson had made during the confrontation on the aircraft, and she watched with growing horror as her own voice filled the small interrogation room, playing back her threats and insults and discriminatory comments in the kind of high-definition clarity that made it impossible to deny or recontextualize what had obviously occurred. This video has been viewed over 6 million times in the past 4 hours. Harrison continued, his voice carrying the kind of professional detachment that suggested he was discussing weather patterns rather than the complete destruction of someone's life and reputation, and it's currently trending at #1 on multiple social media platforms, with hashtags that call for boycotts of Atlantic Airways and criminal prosecution of everyone involved in discriminating against a young black woman. Bridget covered her mouth with her hands as she realized the full scope of what was happening to her, because she had never considered the possibility that her actions would be recorded and broadcast to millions of people who would judge her based on a few minutes of behavior that she was now desperately wishing she could undo. Atlantic Airways has already issued a press release, Harrison said, swiping to display a document on his tablet announcing your immediate termination for gross misconduct and violation of company policies regarding passenger treatment, which means you've lost your job, your pension, and any possibility of receiving severance payments or positive references for future employment. The devastation that was evident on Bridget's face as she processed this information was the kind that came from watching everything she had worked for throughout her adult life disappear in a matter of hours. But Harrison was not finished detailing the consequences that would follow from her actions during the aircraft incident. The Federal Aviation Administration has also been notified of this incident, he continued, and they've indicated that they'll be launching an investigation that could result in your permanent disqualification from any employment in the aviation industry, which means you won't be able to work even as ground crew or in ticket sales for any airline or airport in the United States. Bridget began to sob with the kind of deep, wrenching sounds that came from someone who was experiencing grief for a life that had been destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. And her tears were not just for her lost job, but for the realization that she had revealed herself to be someone whose prejudices had caused real harm to an innocent person. However, Harrison said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone that suggested he was about to present an option that might provide some small measure of relief from the comprehensive destruction that was otherwise inevitable. Mr. Cross is a reasonable man who understands that people sometimes make mistakes that they genuinely regret, and he's prepared to offer you a choice that could limit the civil liability you're facing. Bridget looked up through her tears with the kind of desperate attention that suggested she was willing to consider any possibility that might provide some path through the catastrophe that had engulfed her life. You can plead guilty to the misdemeanor assault charge without attempting to negotiate for a reduced sentence, Harrison explained, and you can issue a public written apology to Amara Cross, acknowledging that your actions were motivated by racial prejudice and apologizing for the harm you caused through your abuse of authority. A criminal record. Bridget whispered, her voice barely audible as she contemplated the reality that she would spend the rest of her life marked as someone who had been convicted of assault with all the limitations on employment and housing that such a conviction would entail. You already have a criminal record, Ms. Miller. Harrison replied with the kind of precision that suggested he was simply clarifying facts rather than delivering additional bad news, because you've already been charged with assault and the evidence against you is overwhelming. So the question is whether you want to face only those charges and the civil consequences that my client chooses to pursue, or whether you want to fight this case and face additional charges that could result in federal prosecution for civil rights violations. Harrison closed his tablet and returned it to his briefcase, preparing to leave Bridget alone to contemplate her options. But before he left, he delivered one final piece of information that would ensure she understood the full scope of what was at stake in her decision. The internet never forgets Miss Miller, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment, "and this video will follow you for the rest of your life regardless of what legal consequences you face. So I'd suggest that you focus on minimizing the additional damage rather than hoping that this situation will somehow improve if you fight it." His meeting with Victoria Vance in the adjacent interrogation room was even briefer because Victoria's situation was complicated by the fact that her husband's construction company had government contracts that could be threatened by association with someone who had been recorded making discriminatory statements in a widely viewed video. Mrs. Vance Harrison said as he entered the room where Victoria was still demanding special treatment despite her circumstances, "I have some information about your husband's response to today's incident that I think you'll find interesting." Finally, Victoria declared, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been expecting vindication and was relieved to finally receive what she assumed would be rescue from her current predicament. "Richard is probably already arranging for my release and preparing lawsuits against everyone responsible for this outrageous treatment." "Actually," Harrison replied, consulting his tablet with the kind of professional calm that suggested he was about to deliver information that would be considerably less welcome than Victoria was expecting. "Your husband's attorneys contacted my office this afternoon to inform us that Mr. Vance will be filing for divorce immediately, citing the morality clause in your prenuptial agreement that allows for termination of the marriage in cases involving criminal behavior or actions that damage his business reputation." The color drained from Victoria's face as she processed the implications of what Harrison had just told her, because she had never imagined that her husband would abandon her when she faced legal consequences for behavior that she had assumed was both normal and justified. "He can't divorce me for this," she said, her voice rising to the kind of desperate pitch that suggested she was beginning to understand that her assumptions about her protected status had been completely wrong. "We have an agreement, and I have rights that can't just be taken away because of a misunderstanding. The prenuptial agreement specifically includes provisions for dissolution of the marriage in cases where one spouse's actions result in criminal charges or public relations disasters that threaten the other spouse's business interests." Harrison explained with the kind of precision that suggested he had reviewed the relevant documents and understood exactly how they applied to Victoria's situation. "And your husband's construction company has government contracts that require employees and family members to maintain clean records and avoid associations with discriminatory behavior." Harrison gathered his materials and prepared to leave Victoria alone with the reality of her situation. But before he departed, he provided one final piece of information that would ensure she understood the complete scope of the consequences that would follow from her actions during the aircraft incident. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice carrying the finality of someone who was delivering a judgment that could not be appealed or modified, "you're facing criminal charges. Divorce proceedings that will leave you with minimal financial resources and a public reputation that will make it difficult for you to find employment or housing in any community that values diversity and inclusion, which in today's world includes most places where you might want to live." As Harrison Thorne walked out of the police station into the humid summer air of Queens, he pulled out his phone to call Victor Cross and report that both women had been thoroughly informed of their situations and the consequences that would follow from their choices during the next phase of legal proceedings. The justice that Victor had promised his daughter was being delivered with the kind of efficiency and thoroughness that only unlimited resources and unlimited determination could achieve. And by the time the sun set on this extraordinary day in aviation history, everyone involved would understand that discrimination and abuse of authority carried prices that extended far beyond anything they had imagined when they first chose to target someone they assumed was powerless to fight back. 6 months after the incident that would forever be known in aviation circles as the day Victor Cross grounded an entire airline with a single phone call, The landscape of commercial air travel had undergone changes that extended far beyond the immediate consequences faced by the individuals who had been directly involved in the discrimination and assault of Amara Cross during what should have been a routine departure from JFK Airport. Atlantic Airways had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection within 2 months of the incident, not because of the immediate financial impact of the fuel embargo that Victor Cross had imposed for exactly 47 minutes, but because of the sustained public relations disaster that had made their brand synonymous with discrimination and passenger mistreatment in the minds of millions of travelers who had watched the video of Bridget Miller and Victoria Vance being arrested for their behavior in first class. The hashtag boycott that had started within hours of the video's release had grown into a sustained consumer movement that had reduced Atlantic Airways booking rates by more than 60% during their peak summer travel season, and their attempts to recover through advertising campaigns and public apologies had only served to remind potential customers of the reason they were boycotting the airline in the first place. But from the ashes of Atlantic Airways' corporate collapse, something new and potentially transformative had emerged because Victor Cross had used his company's resources and connections to purchase the airline's most valuable assets at bankruptcy auction prices, and had created Cross Airways as a demonstration of how aviation companies could operate when they prioritized passenger dignity and employee accountability over profit margins and discriminatory policies. The new airline's headquarters occupied a gleaming office building in Long Island City, with views of the Manhattan skyline, and Amara Cross walked through the executive corridors with the kind of confident bearing that came from knowing that she was helping to build something that could serve as a model for how customer service should function when it was guided by principles of justice and human decency rather than prejudice and arbitrary authority. At 19, she was the youngest non-executive board member in commercial aviation history, a position that her father had created specifically to ensure that passenger experience and ethical treatment would have representation at the highest levels of corporate decision-making. And her responsibilities included overseeing training programs that were designed to prevent the kind of discrimination that had been routine in the industry for decades. The Cross Airways Employee Training Center was located in a converted warehouse in Queens that had been redesigned to simulate various passenger service scenarios, and Amara often spent her afternoons observing sessions where flight attendants and gate agents practiced handling situations involving passengers who didn't fit traditional expectations about who belonged in premium cabins or first-class seating areas. The key thing to remember, she said to a group of new hires who were learning Cross Airways passenger service protocols, is that someone's appearance, age, or clothing choices tell you nothing about their right to be treated with respect and dignity. And our job is to provide excellent service to everyone, regardless of our personal assumptions about their background or economic status. The training scenarios were deliberately designed to challenge unconscious biases with actors playing passengers who might trigger discriminatory responses from service personnel who had been trained to make quick judgments about who deserved premium treatment and who should be questioned, monitored, or discouraged from using services they had legitimately purchased. "What if someone in first class is dressed casually?" asked Jennifer Martinez, a former Atlantic Airways flight attendant who had applied to Cross Airways after witnessing the changes that were occurring in the industry and wanting to be part of an airline that prioritized ethical treatment over traditional hierarchies. "Then they're a first-class passenger who prefers comfortable clothing," Amara replied with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that suggested this should be obvious to anyone who was thinking clearly about the situation, and our response should be the same warm, professional service we would provide to any other customer who had paid for premium treatment. The transformation of aviation industry culture was occurring not just within Cross Airways but throughout the sector because other airlines were discovering that passengers had become much more aware of discriminatory treatment and much more willing to document and publicize incidents where service personnel allowed their biases to influence their professional behavior. Federal regulators had also taken notice of the Cross Industries incident and had implemented new training requirements for all commercial aviation personnel, mandating annual education programs focused on preventing discrimination and ensuring that passenger rights were respected regardless of individual employees' personal prejudices or assumptions about who belonged in various sections of aircraft. The industry changes were being driven not just by regulatory pressure but by economic reality because the success of Cross Airways had demonstrated that passengers were willing to pay premium prices for airlines that guaranteed respectful treatment, and companies that continued to tolerate discriminatory behavior were finding themselves at competitive disadvantages that threatened their long-term viability. Amara's office overlooking the Cross Airways terminal at JFK was decorated with thank-you letters from passengers who had experienced the kind of service that treated everyone as valued customers rather than potential problems to be managed. And she often read through these messages when she needed reminders of why the work she was doing mattered beyond the abstract principles of justice and equality. "Mrs. Cross," wrote a middle-aged black woman from Atlanta, "I just wanted to thank you for creating an airline where I can travel without worrying that my appearance or my children's behavior will result in humiliation or discriminatory treatment from your staff. For the first time in years, I actually enjoyed flying." Another letter from a young Latino man who was a graduate student at Columbia described his experience flying Cross Airways from New York to London. "Your flight attendants treated me with the same courtesy they showed to the business executives and diplomats in first class, and they never once questioned my right to be there or suggested that I might be more comfortable in economy. It made me realize how many other airlines had been making me feel unwelcome without my even fully recognizing it." The financial success of Cross Airways had exceeded even Victor Cross's optimistic projections because the airline's reputation for treating all passengers with dignity had created customer loyalty that translated into consistent bookings and premium pricing power that more traditional carriers couldn't match. But perhaps more importantly from Amara's perspective, the airline was serving as a demonstration that commercial aviation could function as a service industry that genuinely served all customers rather than merely tolerating those who didn't fit traditional profiles of premium passengers. The goal was never just to create another airline, Amara explained to a reporter from Aviation Week who was writing a feature story about the industry changes that had followed the Cross Industries incident, but rather to prove that treating people with basic human respect could be both the right thing to do and the profitable thing to do. And I think we've demonstrated that those two goals don't have to be in conflict with each other. The reporter Sandra Kim had covered the aviation industry for 15 years and had never seen changes occur as rapidly as those that had followed the widely viewed video of Bridget Miller and Victoria Vance being arrested for their treatment of Amara Cross during what should have been a routine commercial flight. "Do you think the changes we're seeing are permanent?" Sandra asked. "Or is this just a temporary response to public pressure that will fade as the incident becomes less prominent in public memory?" Amara considered the question carefully before responding because she understood that the sustainability of the cultural changes they were seeing would depend on whether airlines continued to prioritize ethical treatment when it required additional effort or resources, rather than simply when it was convenient or profitable to do so. "I think what we've learned is that passengers are much more aware of discriminatory treatment than airlines previously understood," she replied, "and they're willing to take their business elsewhere when they encounter service personnel who allow their prejudices to influence their professional behavior. So companies that want to remain competitive are discovering that treating everyone with respect isn't just morally correct but economically necessary." As Sandra Kim concluded her interview and prepared to write her article about the transformation of aviation industry culture, Amara looked out her office window at the Cross Airways terminal where passengers of all backgrounds were being served by flight crews who had been trained to provide excellent service based on customer needs rather than superficial judgments about who deserved premium treatment. The changes that had begun with a single incident of discrimination on Atlantic Airways Flight 882 were continuing to ripple through the industry in ways that were creating opportunities for better service, more ethical treatment, and improved experiences for millions of travelers who had previously been forced to accept prejudicial behavior as an unavoidable aspect of commercial aviation. But for Amara personally, the most meaningful aspect of these industry changes was the knowledge that other young people who looked like her would be less likely to experience the humiliation and discrimination that had been routine in premium cabins before airlines began to understand that their survival depended on treating all customers with the dignity and respect that should have been provided from the beginning. 1 year after the incident that had transformed both her personal life and an entire industry, Amara Cross walked through JFK Terminal 4 with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing that she had played a role in creating changes that would protect future generations of travelers from the discrimination and abuse that had once been accepted as normal aspects of commercial aviation customer service. She was dressed professionally in a tailored navy blue blazer and matching slacks that reflected her position as a member of Cross Airways' board of directors, but she had chosen to walk through the economy section of the terminal rather than using the VIP services that her status would have provided because she wanted to observe how passengers were being treated in the areas where most discrimination typically occurred. The changes in terminal atmosphere were immediately apparent to anyone who had witnessed the hostile environment that had existed before airlines began to understand that their financial survival depended on treating all customers with basic human respect, and the interactions between service personnel and passengers reflected training programs that emphasized dignity and courtesy rather than hierarchical assumptions about who deserved premium treatment. But as Amara passed through the food court area near the economy gates, she felt a sudden hunger that made her decide to stop for a quick snack before continuing her observation of terminal operations, and she walked over to a pretzel stand that was located in the section of the terminal where budget-conscious travelers typically gathered while waiting for their flights. The worker behind the counter had her back turned toward customers while she scrubbed at a persistent stain on the cash register with the kind of frantic intensity that suggested she was trying to remove evidence of some kind of accident or mishap that had occurred during her shift, and her movements had the desperate quality of someone who was afraid that any visible imperfection in her work area might result in criticism from supervisors or customers. "Excuse me," Amara said politely, reading the menu board while she waited for the worker to finish her cleaning and turn around to take her order. "Could I please have a bottle of water and maybe a salted pretzel if they're fresh?" The worker behind the counter froze completely when she heard Amara's voice, her shoulders tensing in a way that suggested she recognized something familiar in the sound, and when she turned around slowly to face her customer, Amara found herself looking into the eyes of someone whose life had been fundamentally altered by the consequences of choices made during a few minutes of discrimination and abuse that had occurred in a first-class cabin just a few hundred yards from where they were now standing. Bridget Miller looked nothing like the confident, authoritative flight attendant who had wielded her uniform and title as weapons against a young black woman whose appearance had triggered her prejudices and power fantasies, because the person standing behind the pretzel counter was someone whose entire identity had been stripped away and rebuilt around the reality of minimum wage employment and the social stigma that followed from being forever associated with viral video footage of racially motivated discrimination. Gone was the carefully styled hair, the perfectly applied makeup, and the tailored uniform that had symbolized Bridget's authority over passengers and her position in the aviation industry hierarchy, replaced by a hairnet, a grease-stained apron, and a name tag that simply read probationary employee without any indication of her previous career or the 12 years of seniority that had been erased in a single moment of revealed prejudice. Bridget's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine terror as she recognized Amara, and her hands began to shake as she processed the surreal reality that she was being asked to provide customer service to the person whose life she had tried to destroy through abuse of authority and discriminatory treatment that had been recorded and broadcast to millions of viewers around the world. Miss Cross Bridget whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the food court, and the formal address carried none of the sneering hostility that had characterized her previous interactions with Amara, replaced instead by the kind of fearful respect that came from understanding exactly how completely the power dynamics between them had been reversed. "Just water, actually," Amara said, her voice carrying the same calm politeness that she had maintained during the original incident despite the abuse and threats that had been directed toward her. "You can keep the pretzel, but I'd appreciate a bottle of water if you have them cold." Bridget scrambled to retrieve a water bottle from the refrigerated section behind the counter, her movements clumsy and desperate as she tried to complete the simple transaction without making any mistakes that might draw additional attention to their interaction. And when she placed the bottle on the counter, she was unable to meet Amara's eyes directly. "That'll be $4, Bridget said, her voice still barely audible, as she tried to process the unreality of charging money to someone whose life she had tried to destroy, and who now had the power to make her current employment even more difficult if she chose to exercise it. Amara placed a $20 bill on the counter, a gesture that was considerably more generous than necessary for a $4 purchase, but that reflected the kind of natural courtesy that had characterized her behavior throughout the original incident, despite the hostility and abuse that had been directed toward her by people who should have been providing professional service. "Keep the change," Amara said, simply, her words carrying none of the vindictive satisfaction that might have been expected from someone who was encountering a person who had caused her significant harm and humiliation, and instead reflecting the kind of genuine grace that came from understanding that dignity was not diminished by treating others with respect, even when they had failed to deserve such treatment. Bridget looked up at that moment, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she struggled to understand why someone she had treated so badly would show her any kindness at all, and her next words came out as barely more than a whisper filled with the weight of a year's worth of regret and self-reflection. "Why," she asked, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke, "after everything I did to you? Why would you be kind to me?" Amara leaned forward slightly, not in a threatening way, but with the kind of gentle attention that suggested she wanted to ensure that her next words would be heard clearly and understood completely. Because this moment represented an opportunity to demonstrate the principles that had guided her behavior throughout the entire ordeal and its aftermath. "Because unlike you," Amara said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that came from deeply held convictions about how people should treat each other, regardless of the circumstances or the history between them, "I don't need to step on other people to feel good about myself." She picked up her water bottle and started to walk away toward the Cross Airways departure gates where her flight to London was preparing for boarding. But before she left the food court area completely, she turned back to deliver one final message that would serve as both closure for the incident and guidance for whatever future Bridget Miller might be able to build from the wreckage of her previous life. "Good luck, Bridget," Amara said, and her words carried the kind of genuine sincerity that made it clear she actually hoped that the woman who had tried to destroy her would somehow find a way to become a better person through the consequences she was facing. "I hope you figure out how to be better than you were that day." As Amara walked toward the exclusive glass doors that led to the Cross Airways jet bridge, she didn't look back to see Bridget Miller standing behind the pretzel counter with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the difference between the person she had been and the person she might still have the opportunity to become if she could learn from the hardest lesson of her life. The boarding process for Cross Airways Flight 247 to London was everything that commercial aviation should be, but rarely was efficient without being impersonal, professional without being cold and respectful of every passenger's dignity, regardless of their appearance, age, or economic status. The flight crew welcomed each passenger with genuine smiles and helpful service that reflected training programs designed to treat everyone as valued customers, rather than potential problems to be managed or controlled. As Amara settled into her first-class seat and prepared for the flight that would take her back to Oxford for the start of her junior year, she reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in both her personal life and the aviation industry during the year since a routine flight had been transformed into a catalyst for justice and transformation. The incident had cost Bridget Miller and Victoria Vance their careers, their financial security, and their social standing. But it had also created opportunities for thousands of other people to experience air travel without the fear of discrimination or humiliation that had previously been accepted as inevitable aspects of commercial aviation for passengers who didn't fit traditional profiles of premium customers. More importantly, from Amara's perspective, the changes had demonstrated that individuals could make a difference when they refused to accept injustice as normal and were willing to use whatever resources and influence they possessed to create accountability for people who abused their authority against vulnerable targets. As the Cross Airways Gulfstream lifted off from JFK and climbed toward cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean, Amara looked down at the terminal where she had experienced one of the most challenging moments of her young life and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal trauma into positive change that would benefit countless future travelers who would never know her name, but would benefit from the dignity and respect that was now standard rather than exceptional in commercial aviation. This story began with arrogance meeting its match, and it ends with a simple truth. Character is revealed not by how we treat those who can help us, but by how we treat those we believe cannot hurt us. Bridget Miller learned too late that the uniform doesn't make the person, and that true authority comes from service, not from power over others. The transformation of an industry started with one young woman's refusal to accept injustice as normal, proving that dignity maintained under pressure can be more powerful than any title or position. When we choose respect over prejudice, we don't just change individual lives, we change the world around us, one interaction at a time. Sometimes the most important battles are won, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple act of refusing to let others diminish our worth, and then using our strength to ensure that future generations won't face the same challenges we overcame. If you enjoyed this story of justice and transformation, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. What do you think? Did Bridget deserve a second chance, or was justice served? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, treat everyone with the respect they deserve as a human being. Because you never know when your character will be tested or who might be watching when it matters most.